Hello, everyone. So thank you very much and welcome to, I think this is the last session, isn't it? I always get the last session of a conference. So it's a real privilege, I think that's the right word, to be here with world-leading experts on educational inequality. And I am Chief Executive of the Sutton Trust charity and the Education Endowment Foundation I'm a trustee of, and those two foundations are dedicated to basically narrowing the gap between education haves and have-not. So I've commissioned a lot of the research, some for Sandra actually in years past, but not for Sean and Bridget. But I think in many ways Britain can lay claim to have sort of invented the education gap. We private schools, I think it was around 600 AD, right? This will impress our American colleagues here. 600 AD, the first independent schools emerged, and it wasn't until about 1,200 years later that we had the first campaign to educate poor children. So it took a millennium or so to sort of to raise that agenda. Americans, being Americans, of course, they come up with bigger education gaps, right? So I think you'll all seen over the last century or so, particularly, that they've become bigger. And I always joke at international conferences, actually, that being in London working on the stuff I do, I'm always reminded of what I do on the journey to work, because I don't know if you're on the tube, you're told, mind the gap. So every time I go into my workplace, I'm reminded of that. So the Trust has commissioned lots of research over the years, as many other organisations have, and I think it's fair to say that the gap between education haves and have-nots, whether that's attainment, progress, enrolment, graduation, which we'll hear a lot about today, is probably the most unassailable and robust findings of education research, I would argue. It's one of the most depressing, of course, findings as well. We know the gap starts early, in the womb, in fact. We know it presents itself very starkly before school's even started. We know in the UK and US, and I think we'll hear a bit more about this today, that it widens. And we know of no country, although I might be proven wrong on this, that where the gap is actually consistently narrowed. I've seen where the gap might have been held constant, but certainly not narrowed consistently. We also know, and Sean's done a lot of work on this, that the gaps have actually got bigger over for recent generations, certainly in the US, I think, and in the UK it's certainly been held extremely stark. So I think one of the things that would be good to discuss in this session is the fact that this challenges, I think, our notion of education as the great social leveller. I think most people in this room probably would agree with that as a broad aim, but I think the data sort of challenges that. So I think one of the things that would be good to get from our three speakers is not just reflecting on the gaps, but also perhaps what is the evidence of how we might actually bridge those gaps. I think it'd be good to get a bit of discussion about policy, because we do know there are countries where there are narrower gaps in education with similar other characteristics outside schools. We know places in the US even and in the UK that have narrow gaps. So it'd be good to sort of get into that discussion as well. So I'm going to be quite strict on this. I'm going to give you all 20 minutes at most. So I think we'll have Sean first. You all know Stanford University. I won't go into your whole career, but you're going to talk about gaps really in the schools sector, and then Bridget's going to talk about higher education gaps, and then Sandra, this is a perfect. You're going to talk about early years and vocational. So we're going to cover all the education phases. There's going to be a bit of UK and US in there as well. So Sean, I'll hand over to you. So we'll have 20 minutes, then perhaps a few questions for Sean, then we'll have Bridget 20 minutes and a few questions, then Sandra, and at the end we'll have a general panel discussion. So I'll hand over to Sean. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lee. How do I make my slide show up here?
Oh, don't ask me.
Just click and see what happens.
Wow. They know things at Harvard. All right. Well, thank you, Lee, and thank you, Jane, for inviting me. I want to just use my 15 or 20 minutes just to give you an overview of a couple features of educational inequality in the United States, both both a description of the trends over the last 40 or 50 years in those, but also some newer data showing the real dramatic geographic variation in patterns of academic achievement in the United States. So the questions that sort of animate what I want to talk about today and the work I've been doing for a while are descriptive questions about how much achievement measured by test scores varies across places in the United States and how they change over time. And I want to distinguish, I want to be clear here that when I'm talking about places, I'm talking about communities, not just school systems. That is, I'm interested in how much the characteristics of a community, not just the things that happen in schools, but things that happen in neighborhoods, in early childhood experiences, in the homes, in preschool centers, in after-school programs, as well as in the public education system, how much those things affect children's educational outcomes, because I think it's important to think of educational outcomes as the product of all of that sort of stuff, not just the product of things that happen in the school building during the school year. And then secondly, sort of asking questions about why the patterns have changed over time and why they vary to the extent they do. What are the features of context that matter, and what can we do about it? I'm not going to spend a lot of time today on the what can we do about it, or even the why. I'm going to focus mostly on some broad description that's suggestive of the whys and suggestive of the what can we do about it, as a way of kind of doing what I think of as sort of educational epidemiology, that is a kind of a laying out of the broad patterns of outcomes as the groundwork for sort of understanding the processes that produce them and thinking about solutions. So this first figure shows the trends in the achievement gaps in the United States over the last 50 years or so. The black line is the achievement gap between high income and low income children in the United States, and the red and the blue lines are the gaps, the racial ethnic gaps, that is the gap between whites and blacks and whites and Hispanic students in the US. And the key story here is that those two types of achievement gaps have had really different trends over the last 50 years or so. The racial achievement gaps in the United States were very large for children born in the 1950s and 1960s and declined dramatically over a 20-year, 30-year period, and then leveled out somewhat, but have been declining again in the last decade or two. In contrast, the achievement gaps between high and low income children were much smaller for children born in the 50s and 60s and grew dramatically for children born from the 1970s through 2000, and now are much bigger than the racial achievement gaps, whereas they used to be smaller. I'm not going to talk today about the racial achievement gaps given time, but I will say something about why the income gap has grown. So there's a couple potential explanations for this. One is just that this rise in the income achievement gap coincides with the rise in income inequality in the United States. So this is a figure taken from the work of Emmanuel Saez and Thomas Piketty that shows the long-term trend in income inequality in the United States over the last century. Income inequality in the US was very high before World War II. It declined precipitously during World War II as the US economy changed and price controls, wage controls, lots of things went into play that changed the nature of the economy for a long time. But starting around 1980, income inequality grew dramatically in the United States. It's now higher than it's ever been in the last century. And that growth in income inequality coincides roughly with the timing of the growth in the income achievement gap. So one obvious sort of explanation is that as income inequality grows, high income and low income families have much different incomes than they do when income inequality is low, and families can use those resources then in ways that affect their children's academic outcomes. What we've seen actually, though, when we look closer at the data, is that it's not just that the incomes are different, but the relationship between income and academic achievement has gone up in the United States. That is, the benefit to a child for every extra dollar of their parents' income is greater for more recent cohorts than it was for older cohorts. So it's not just a mechanical widening of inequality, but that income seems to matter more. So that raises the question of what are families doing with their extra income that might benefit their children. And one thing is they're spending more of their money on enrichment activities for their children. So these are data taken from Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane. These are based on the Consumer Expenditure Survey in the United States, where families are asked what they spend their money on, and they go back to the 1970s, and so both low-income and high-income families have increased how much money they spend on their children, and this is spending on things that might benefit children's cognitive development, like childcare and preschool, like books, like library and museum visits, like tutoring, things like that. And the average low-income family in the United States increased their spending on their children by about 50% in real dollars over this time period, but the average high-income family increased their spending by about 150%. So everyone in the United States is spending more money on their children over the last 40 years, but high-income families have increased their spending at a much faster rate. If you look at the data on how much time parents spend with their children, highly educated parents are spending a lot more time with their children. Less educated parents are also spending more time with their children, but not increasing at the same rate. So you see this sort of growing divide in families' investments in their children in terms of the money they spend on them, in terms of the time they spend with them. You see it also in kind of measures of parenting activities like reading to children and things like that. So this suggests that families not only have more money, but they are spending it, sort of investing it more in their children's educational outcomes. One other way they spend their money is that they spend it on housing. They spend it on where they live. So segregation by income in the United States has gone up dramatically over the same last 40 years. So this figure is from a study that I did with Kendra Bischoff, and it shows the proportion of families who live in different kinds of neighborhoods over the last 40 years. The darker blue are the proportion of families living in affluent communities, and the darker red is the proportion of families living in poor communities, and the sort of middle ones are families living in sort of mixed income, middle income neighborhoods. And you can see that we went from about 2/3 of families living in one of those sort of mixed income, middle income kind of neighborhoods to about 40% today. So a dramatic decline in the number of mixed income neighborhoods and an increase in the number of families who either live in very affluent or very poor neighborhoods. Ann Owens at USC has looked more closely at this in a recent paper that just came out last month, and she finds that all of this increase in income segregation appears to be driven by the increasing segregation of families with school-age children. Households without children are no more economically segregated in the U.S. today than they were 30, 40 years ago, but families with children are much more segregated. So it seems like families with children are increasingly spending their money, if they have it, on buying a good neighborhood and therefore buying what they think of as a good school system. So income inequality seems to lead, suggests like it leads to this growing achievement gap, but not just because parents have more money in a mechanical sense, but because they're increasingly using that money to invest in good neighborhoods and schools and enrichment activities for their kids, and using their time to invest in their children as well. The one thing you might have noticed, and I don't know how to go backwards in the slides, so I can't. The one thing you might have noticed is that I'm going to try one thing here. Oh, look at that. Okay, I know what I'm doing. So the one thing you might notice in the black line here is that the achievement gap, the income achievement gap, which went up from the mid-'70s through around 2000, has started to decline again in the most recent data, particularly in reading, but it's also true in math. When we look at the most recent data on children's school readiness when they enter kindergarten, so we compare kindergartners who entered school in 1998 to kindergartners who entered school in 2010, and we look at the achievement gap by income and by race, and both the racial and the economic achievement gaps declined over that 12-year period by about 16% in the case of reading for the income achievement gap, and by about 10% in the case of math. So this increase we saw over the 25 years prior has started to turn around and decline. And so one of the things that I and some of my colleagues, including Jane Waldfogel and Daphne Basak at University of Virginia, have been looking at is trying to understand why has this achievement gap declined over the recent time periods where it was increasing so dramatically before. Income inequality has continued to go up. So what's driving the recent decline? And our preliminary evidence suggests that low-income families are increasingly investing more of their time in kids' cognitive development activities. That is, low-income families report reading a lot more to their kids than they used to. They go to libraries and museums a lot more than they used to. High-income families have increased doing those things as well, but not nearly at the same rate over the last decade as low-income families. The use of computers children using computers sort of for games that are designed to teach math and reading skills has gone up dramatically for everyone as computers have become much more prevalent, but it's gone up much faster for low-income families than high-income families. They still are less likely to have a computer, but not nearly as less likely to have a computer and have their child use it for those kinds of activities as they used to. So a lot of measures like that suggest that what we saw for the previous 25 years, that was this widening disparity in the kinds of activities families were doing with their children around cognitive development. Those disparities have started to narrow even as income inequality has continued to rise in the United States. And one sort of story, though I can't prove this, but a story that Jane and Daphne and I have sort of been thinking about is a story of sort of the diffusion of a technology as it's adopted. If you think about sort of as a new technology is introduced, say a medical technology or something, it's often quite expensive, and the early adopters tend to be the folks with the most resources. And so innovations can often be inequality producing or inequality generating initially, and then they become inequality reducing as those innovations become widely diffused and adopted by many people. And if you think of sort of investment in children, particularly in things that are relatively inexpensive investments in children, high-income families started doing those things much earlier in the United States, and low-income families now have sort of started to do those, partly through a lot of like public information campaigns that have spread the word about how important the early years are. And so it suggests that there may be a sort of a turning point in this inequality, partly as a result of the diffusion of the idea that investing in your children's cognitive development is sort of essential. So I'm going to now turn to talk about the spatial variation of achievement across places. So how much does achievement vary not across time, but across place in the United States? And the challenge of doing this in the United States is we don't have a single national exam system. We test our students a lot. Our U.S. school children take well over 50 million standardized tests every year, just in public schools. But every state administers its own tests. The tests differ in different grades. They often change from one year to the next. They're not measured on a comparable scale. And then the way that the scores are publicly reported is in this sort of coarsened way, where instead of knowing an actual score, we sort of know if a student is advanced or proficient or basic or below basic or something. And so this makes comparing test scores across places nearly impossible in the United States. I and Andrew Ho have spent a lot of time over the last 4 years developing and validating a set of methods for basically putting all state standardized tests on a common national scale, essentially putting them on the NAEP scale, the National Assessment of Progress scale. And so that means we can compare test scores in every public school in the United States across grades 3 to 8 and across time in a way we've never been able to do before. And so I'll show you some of the results from that. So these data, the data that I'll show you here are publicly available at ceta.stanford.edu. Basically, the data here cover about 11,000 school districts in the United States. That's almost every school district in the United States. They cover grades 3 to 8, math and English learning, English language arts tests, 5 years of data. We have scores by race and ethnicity, by gender, by free lunch status, by English learner status, and so on. I'm not going to show you that today. These data are based on about 215 million test scores, so they're remarkably precise, even in small school districts. We get very precise estimates of average performance because there's a lot of data. And we link this then to census data, American Community Survey data, and other data about school systems to try to look at the relationship between features of communities and school systems and achievement. So I'm just going to show you a few quick things from that today. So the way we can look at the data is, if you imagine that the average student growth trajectory looks like this. In 3rd grade, they score at about the 3rd grade level, and at 8th grade, they score at about the 8th grade level. Right, that's the definition of average. So if we look at a few different school districts, these are 3 school districts that are roughly equal in sort of poverty and socioeconomic status. Baltimore and Chicago are two large urban cities. Union City is a moderate to small, moderate-sized school district in New Jersey, very, very densely populated, about 95% Hispanic students. And you can see that Union City students score a little bit above average in 3rd grade and maintain that level of performance through 8th grade. Chicago students score well below average, about a grade and a half below average in 3rd grade, but catch up almost to average level by 8th grade. Baltimore students show a different pattern. They're about a half grade level by 3rd grade and about 2 grades below average by 8th grade. So there's variation not only in where we see test scores in 3rd grade, but also at the slopes from 3rd to 8th grade. You can think about the sort of level in 3rd grade as a kind of measure of opportunity children have had in that community in early childhood and in the early elementary grades, and you can think of the growth rate from 3rd to 8th grade as a measure of relative improvement, much of which is likely due to the school system, but not all of which, of course, because there's other factors in kids' lives from 3rd to 8th grade than schools. So think of those two measures, level in 3rd grade and growth rate, and now I'll show you what those look like nationally. So this is a picture of the average performance in every school district in the United States. Purple is below average, and green, that would be green. Green is above average. So you can see, while there are some broad patterns, low average performance in much of the West and much of the sort of Deep South, high performance in much of New England. There's also a lot of variation even within region. There are high-performing places in the South, low-performing places in the Midwest and the Northeast, and so on. If we look at growth rates, we see a somewhat different pattern. That is, there's not nearly the same kind of regional pattern. There's much more of a checkerboard. There are places with high growth rates next to places with low growth rates, and so on. It's a little overwhelming to try to take all that in, so let's look at it a different way in relationship to the socioeconomic conditions of a community. So this, yep, I'm almost there. So this is 12,000 school districts. Each dot is a school district, and the horizontal axis is a measure of the average socioeconomic conditions, parents' education, income, occupation, poverty rates, and so on in places. And then the vertical axis is sort of grade levels relative to the national average, and you can see this very strong correlation between socioeconomic conditions and average performance. That correlation is about 0.8. That said, there is real variation. So there's Union City, Chicago, and Baltimore. Chicago and Baltimore have average levels that are typical for places of their kind of socioeconomic level. Union City is much higher. There's a book about Union City that David Kerp wrote. You can read to understand what he thinks is responsible for Union City, but mostly the story is about lots of investment in high-quality public preschool and lots of investment in bilingual education. We can look at the 100 largest school districts in the United States. You see they vary dramatically, not just in their socioeconomic condition, but also in their achievement, but even among places. So the big dots there are New York, Los Angeles, Chicago. You can see even among very large districts, there's sizable variation in achievement performance, even though they're relatively similar in socioeconomic status. So I heard a talk today earlier about the London effect, right? So in some ways you could do sort of similar analyses of places in the US to try to understand what's wrong in Los Angeles, what's right in New York, and so on. If we look at the districts a different way, though, we see some interesting patterns. So this is every state, every school district in 2 states. The red dots are Massachusetts school districts. The white dots are California school districts. And you can see that a lot of the variation isn't just because districts differ from one another, but there's something state-specific here. All the Massachusetts districts basically score well above what you would predict based on their socioeconomic conditions, and virtually all of the California ones, particularly the middle and low-income California ones, score well below what you would predict. And I'll just end with 2 final things. So this is a picture of the growth rates by socioeconomic status, and you can see while there is some trend, that is more affluent places show higher growth on average from 3rd to 8th grade, it's not nearly so pronounced as the levels. That is, there's a lot of variability. And you see this if you look at our Chicago, Union City, and Baltimore example. Chicago has growth rates that are almost 25% faster than the average school district in the United States and much, much faster than the average low-income school district in the United States. Even though students there start out well behind in third grade, they make great progress. That sort of goes against, I think, the standard picture of Chicago as the large urban failing school system. Something is happening in Chicago, whether it's in the schools or somewhere else, that's promoting high levels of growth and academic performance over those grades. Baltimore, of course, is the opposite. And Union City doesn't stand out as a big outlier in growth. It's a big outlier because kids get to third grade well above average in Union City, not because they grow quickly. So the last thing I'll just show you is this, and that is that when we look at other data that tracks children from kindergarten through 8th grade, the size of the income achievement gap doesn't change that much from kindergarten through 8th grade. That suggests that a lot of the disparities in educational performance for low and high income students are sort of baked in by the time kids get to kindergarten and don't change a whole lot. And so what we're finding in lots of the data I've looked at is that opportunity structure in the early years, in preschool and in early elementary, is much more important in terms of long-term performance than is what happens in 3rd through 8th grade. Socioeconomic context of communities is by and far the most powerful force, predictor of academic achievement. But in other analyses I didn't show you here, racial and socioeconomic segregation also are highly predictive of achievement, and achievement gaps net of all this other stuff. That is, places that are more segregated have more disparities in achievement, even conditional on everything else. So I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Bridget.
Sean, just before you sit down,
Yeah, you have a few questions.
yeah, so I was going to, chance for just a couple of questions for Sean just before we hand over.
I don't think we have time. Yeah.
Yeah? Okay, fine,
Yeah,
okay.
I'm happy to cede my time.
Yep, no, Jane, I'll do whatever you say. Okay, so thank you, Sean. Bridget next.
Okay.
And yeah, I'll sit here again, and I'll give you a 3-minute warning like I did for Sean.
Excellent. Well, good afternoon. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here. Special thanks to Jane and to Lee for putting together this panel and for moderating, and to see so many familiar faces. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit to talk about higher education. And so I've been studying education for several decades now, a couple decades now. And one thing I want to point out is, the disparities that we see in primary, secondary, K through 12 education have been there for years. And so one of the things that definitely has drawn me to looking at higher education is to ask the question, so what do we do after generations and generations have gone through school systems that are failing us? Can higher education be second chance institutions, or do we give up on students when they're 18 years old? So that's really motivated a lot of my attention and work. So I'm going to start out giving some more information about the gaps that we see, but then I'm anxious to push on and talk a little bit about some of the possible solutions, or what are the key problems and possible solutions to address these gaps. So I'll start off by just showing you this. This is the college continuation rate. There's lots of different ways to define this. This happens to be for 18 to 24-year-olds, whether or not they're going on to college. And each line represents a quartile of the income distribution. So you can see the purple, the lowest quartile, and the blue, the highest. And looking over time, this is from 1965 to 2015. It may not look it, but there you see this general kind of slow increase over time, where in the United States, you can tell the story that gradually more and more students are going into higher education. They may not be going directly at 18, they may be going when they're a little bit older, but for the top 25%, you have 82% of students now going to college. But unfortunately, the bottom 25%, in the late 60s, 1970, it was 28%. It's now risen to about 45%. So you see growth over time, but the distance between that top line and that bottom line has not been shrinking. And this has been after decades of billions and trillions of dollars in financial aid and academic supports, many things that are happening more in high schools. We still see this gap between the rich and the poor. Well, one thing that's been really beneficial in the last 10 to 15 years for all of education research is we have better data. And so this is from some work that I've done with Zach Mabel, who's a current doctoral student of mine, where about 10, 12 years ago, we were able to get this amazing data from the state of Ohio, where the governor wanted to get a better sense of what was going on with the higher education system, given the amount of tax dollars. So they started tracking every student over time. And we used this to look at a number of different things in the Ohio higher education system, and now you see some other states that have made these data available. So this is looking at persistence in college. So imagine we have a system where we have a number of low-income students, students of color, traditionally disadvantaged groups who are not graduating high school, but this is the group of students who actually make it to higher education, make it to college, and looking at the first semester where 100% everyone's there, and then tracking over time how many people are left semester after semester, so it's tracking persistence. And what you can see, that top line is the top 20% of the income distribution, the bottom line is the bottom 20% of the income distribution. So even if you just start with those who are successful with high school and make it to college, over time, if you track them in college, you see that the lower income students are not persisting. We also see significant gaps by race and ethnicity, significant gaps by gender, although in terms of gender, women are doing better than men. And we see this in many educational outcomes, but over time, who's making it to actual degree completion, there's great gaps there. And so one question would be, given we know we have an unequal K through 12 system, is some of this explained by academic preparation levels, where we wouldn't necessarily expect for students coming from certain schools to do quite as well? Well, one easy way to cut this is try to look within test scores. And so here, I'm just looking at students who scored 25 or above on the ACT, which is similar to the SAT, one of our college entrance exams. A 25 is actually a quite high score. It puts you in the top 25% of students taking the exam. And we looked at bachelor's degree attainment within 6 years. It's interesting, the convention is, even though it's a 4-year degree, we look at 6-year outcomes. And so this is focusing again on the top 25% of test takers. And what you see, the graduation rate, the 6-year graduation rate, and the top 20% is 83% in comparison to 69%. And so this is what's caused a lot of attention within the US, where you have a number of low-income students who actually seem like they're academically prepared to go to college. They've scored high on tests, but what's going on somewhere along the process where they're not making it to the finish line? So we have these persistent problems in enrollment, persistence, completion. I could have put up any number of charts, but I knew that I was only supposed to have 20 minutes. And I'm going to talk just briefly about 3 of the major problems that help to explain some of these gaps, and a great deal of research that have been done on these issues, including by some people who are in the audience today. So first, starting with affordability in the US being a major problem, and I know that in other countries, including in the UK, with starting to charge tuition and so forth, that's still, you know, the US dwarfs that in terms of the rate of growth in our prices. This is one snapshot of it. It's actually looking at the growth of prices over time, and I wish I had a little pointer to point some things out to you. What you can see are the top 3 lines are the public 4-year colleges, the private 4-year colleges, and the public 2-year colleges or community colleges. And you can see, starting in 1988, what the growth rate has been, the percentage change every year. The reason why it's such dramatic, to try to give you some kind of baseline, is that blue line with the large diamonds, that's what's happened to family income over time. So median family income has gone up about the rate of inflation. I have the CPI up there. But in comparison, tuition prices have been going up much, much faster. So while we've always had concerns about affordability for the traditional kind of low-income families, the bottom 25% of the income distribution, what you see in the US is now the middle income and even the upper middle income having real concerns about affordability, given how quickly tuition prices have been going up. The green line, just so you know, given there was a big debate in the US about universal health care and how expensive health care costs are, the green line picks up some of that. That's the price of prescription drugs over time. And as you can see, tuition prices have well outpaced even health care costs in terms of growth. So a lot of what's happened has been the shift towards loans, although this has become a great media topic of recent history. This is a graph from one of Sudanarski's papers. There was a key change in federal policy in 1992, where all of a sudden loans were made available to everyone, and then loan limits were raised more recently, and so that's where you see this taking off of the federal loans. And it's actually not surprising that it was the late 90s, early 2000s that we started hearing articles about kids going to college, graduating, and coming back to live with their parents. It synced up very nicely with increases in loan debt. So affordability is a big issue. I'm going to keep moving on. I'll just say there is a large literature that documents the fact that financial aid works, that it has improved enrollment and choice and persistence. But moving on to the academic barriers, a very big one is remediation in higher education. So given what we've talked about that's happening in K through 12 and differences there, the fact is a large number of students when they get to American colleges and universities aren't ready for so-called college level material. So they're putting courses that focus on high school level courses. This became a contentious issue in New York about a decade ago, and Rudy Giuliani was famous for saying, you know, why should we pay college level prices for these high school level courses? Putting those together. So they're also called developmental or basic education depending on what state you live. There were always federal records that thought about a third of students were involved with this. In some work I've done with Eric Bettinger looking at a number of state administrative data sets, when you actually look closely at the courses, it looks like the number is actually 35 to 40% of first-year students. If you go to community colleges, you have 55, 60% of first-year students have to take these high school level courses, again paying college tuition prices, before they can actually do post-secondary level work. And it's not just recent high school graduates, it's also older non-traditional students coming back to college who need to take these courses. So when we think in the United States about what are the key gateways or gatekeepers into higher education or post-secondary study, it turns out price is very important. Yes, we have selected admissions at about 10% of our colleges and universities, but it's really this placement exam that decides whether or not you're taking high school courses or remediation. That's the key academic gatekeeper in the US. And so there's been a lot more attention recently on, are these programs helping students prepare for long-term success in higher education? And this is also where the links between higher education and K through 12 have become much more important. So making sure when students get there, they can actually do the work. Because the problem is, as you would imagine, underprepared students are a lot less likely to graduate. But I want to push on. So after doing a great deal of work on affordability issues and on issues of academic preparation and remediation, the thing that kept striking me, and you go to college workshops in high schools, you talk to parents, you just listen, is the fact that we have lots of financial aid programs that students aren't using. Why is that? Students, they have time in their schedule, but they're not taking the right math classes that they need in order to prepare for college. And so both of the affordability issue and the academic preparation issue are linked together by this information barrier. The fact that there are a lot of complex processes. There are a number of things that students need to do to navigate their way through the educational system, to get to college, to stay in college, and to graduate. And so this gives you one very partial snapshot. If you just think about a student's junior and senior year in high school, their last 2 years in secondary school, of all the little things that you have to do, and even taking the college entrance exam, taking the SAT, if you're a low-income student worrying about fee waivers, you have to register for the exam, hopefully you do a little bit of prep ahead of time. You take the exam, and if you don't register early enough, you might have to take it at a faraway place. How are you going to deal with the transportation to get there? You get your scores back. How do you interpret these scores? What do they mean? Do I retake the exam, which is oftentimes what we see more affluent students doing? So even that one thing about taking the SAT or the ACT is lots of steps that you have to do in order under certain deadlines. And if you trip up on any of them, then you might miss that particular task, and then it shuts off a number of opportunities to you. College search, college applications, FAFSA completion, where I've done a lot of work, college choice. So again, thinking about these processes, they weren't, from a policy standpoint or for a process standpoint, designed in any way, as you'll see in a moment, that are testing actual logic, or it doesn't make sense unless you've actually gone through the process yourself or you have someone who is trained to guide you through it. And so what I've started to see in a bunch of my work is the fact that what's tripping up low-income students is the fact that they aren't navigating these processes, where more affluent students are going to certain schools where they have guidance counselors or parents who've gone to college, can have a lot more information about how to get through, these things. So The role of information actually is important in all of these different processes. For a very long time, we said that students had too little information. They didn't know that the Pell Grant existed. They didn't realize how important it was to take the SAT. They have lots of bad and incorrect information. They're getting it from their friends who are just making it up. They're not sure. We give them very late information. We don't tell them that they're eligible for financial aid until a couple of months before they're supposed to go to college, rather than telling them earlier when they might make very different academic preparation decisions. And then we've gone on to the other side where we say, okay, people need information. So now there's so much information, there's the information overload. And you can take, for example, the federal government put together the College Navigator saying we want to make more information available to students. You go on there, and for any college, there are 300 different facts. There's no sense of which are the most important facts for you to know and to understand, that not all facts are created equally. You might actually want to know something about the graduation rate or the loan default rate or other things like that. The processes, again, are unclear and cumbersome. And so more recently, a lot of my work and the work of others has been thinking about the fact that information in and of itself is a cost. It's costly to collect, costly to sort, costly to process. And when you think of low-income, first-generation families, this is certainly going to be a major challenge for them. Meanwhile, the consequences of making poor decisions are huge because higher education has become a very expensive and, in some respects, risky investment. Not only where you go, but what you study and how much debt you take on. So just briefly, I'll mention behavioral economics has been very growing in this area, and part of my work is in this area. Questions about maybe, the United States is very much built on choice at all times. We don't want to track you, but then perhaps too much choice is bad, and maybe we are actually inadvertently tracking people by the processes we set up. And the fact that non-experts are especially daunted by a decision. When they will procrastinate. So simplifying options and providing assistance. So just briefly, I'll go over two examples. The first, some of you may be aware of my work with the FAFSA, which is the Federal Financial Aid Form. In the US, in order to get any kind of financial aid, whether it's a loan or a grant, you have to complete this form first. It's definitely a form. It continues to be, although this work was starting in the late, say, 2007, 2008, lack of information, misinformation, lack of awareness of the form, missed deadlines. Even people who completed the FAFSA were completing it late, so they weren't getting financial aid they might have been able to receive. And again, the fact that we don't tell students, say high school seniors, until spring, just months before graduation, that they're eligible for aid. And so this FAFSA experiment that I did with Eric Bettinger, who's a colleague of Sean's, Phil Oreopoulos, who's at the University of Toronto, and Lisa Sambumatsu, who's at the NBER, we were testing the effects of what if you simplified that process and gave some assistance with it, what would happen? It was basically trying to see, is the process a barrier, and what happens when you just, and as it turned out, spent 8 minutes with a family helping them fill out this form. And so what happened, families came into H&R Block tax offices, a place where they could get their taxes done. At the end of that, if they were low income, it prompted the tax professional to ask, would you like to learn more about higher education? If they said yes, they filled out a short survey, then they were randomized and into the treatment group. We would take that tax information that they just gave. We would use it to fill out the financial aid form, which about half to two-thirds of the form just come from the tax information. There was a short protocol to ask a few additional questions to finish up the form, and on the spot, we gave them an estimate. Here's how much aid you should be able to receive given your income. And oh, by the way, here are the prices of local colleges, just so you don't think that everything costs as much as Harvard does. Harvard, we get a lot of press, and sometimes that's for ill, that people tend to think that every college costs $55,000. If you look at community colleges and other schools, particularly after financial aid, you find that the cost may actually be zero to the student. So we gave them that information. And then we had worked out with the U.S. Department of Education being able to submit their financial aid forms. And just briefly can say that barrier, and again, it was only 8 minutes to fill out that form, we had huge effects, that we increased by 7 percentage points the students going to college. And so the question of, well, maybe when you dangle all this money in front of families, they said, oh, I'm going to go to college, but they're really not serious. Maybe they're not persisting. Well, we continued to track them, and they were persisting in college, 8 percentage points more likely to be enrolled 2 consecutive years than the control group. And what it actually looks like happen is it increased the likelihood that they would enroll immediately, and it increased their aid receipt. And I can say from some other work, the more financial aid you have, it seems to have a positive impact on persistence. So the key takeaway from here, and again, thinking about policy design, is it doesn't look like the skills needed to fill out the FAFSA, which are very complicated, are the same skills needed to actually persist in college. Okay, I'm not saying that we shouldn't actually have applications and barriers, sometimes to make sure people are serious, but, the critique that, well, we need the FAFSA to be hard because we don't want everyone to go to college, this definitively said, the skills you needed to fill out the form are very different than the skills needed to succeed in an educational environment. So thinking about how important policy design processes are, and I think this was one of the studies to say, these seemingly small barriers actually can have tremendous effects when we think about the gaps that we see for traditionally disadvantaged groups versus more affluent groups who have more resources and experience dealing with these forms. Just briefly, I'll talk about a study that we're just finishing up right now, which is looking at college savings and the fact because college is so expensive, the government and many states have been encouraging families to save for college using 529 accounts, or in the U.S. it's become very popular where a cohort will be adopted. So for example, in San Francisco, all the kindergartners get these savings accounts that they will start getting statements about and watch over time, and it's supposed to give them a sense that someone's putting money away for you so you can go to school in the future. But what we see is families are not saving. Again, very similar to what we see with the financial aid application and other kinds of educational processes, low awareness, misperceptions, they're too complex, families procrastinate, they have little disposable income, all the series of reasons that we also see in whether or not they apply to charter schools and whether or not they take advantage of other kinds of resources. And so with Eric Bettinger, we did a similar kind of randomized control trial. Here we're actually going down to middle and high school. So these are the parents of 7th to 10th graders coming to the Boston Public Schools or libraries where we did workshops, hour-long, 45-minute workshops about how to help your child prepare for college both academically and financially. The control group just got the informational workshop. In treatment group 1, we also offered assistance. We said, hey, college savings is really important. If you can just save $15 a month over the course of 4 years, you'll have enough money to pay for books and transportation. And if you want some help, we have someone who's willing to help you with the form, answer any kind of questions. And just similar to our college financial aid application, if you look at the 529 application, I'm sure it looks similar to your 403Bs, your retirement, it's 6-point font, lots of complicated words, it's 6 pages long. You really only have to fill out 2, but no one really knows that. Again, very complicated process, not very user-friendly for a family who is well-meaning trying to help their child. So the treatment group offered assistance. And then the second treatment group, we offered the assistance and the information, but we also offered to open the account for them and put in the initial $50 deposit, which is the minimum in the state of Massachusetts. And just briefly to jump to the end, what we saw here is first of all, information alone was not going to get people over the hurdle. Assistance didn't do very much here by opening the account for them. And this, again, is very similar to what San Francisco is doing. New York is contemplating. Boston actually is in the process of designing, creating an account where there's a little bit of money there. That actually got people to take us up on our offer. But most importantly, after they set up the accounts, and got over that initial barrier of that really complicated application, they now quarterly get statements from Fidelity saying, you have this money, it's in an account, it's waiting for you, let us know when your child wants it. And oh, by the way, if you want to make any more deposits, it's really, really easy. And grandparents can contribute, and aunts and uncles and godparents, et cetera. And so what we saw, and we continue to track the accounts, is about 1/3 of the parents, first of all, set up automatic monthly contributions where they were doing that $15 a month. And over time, we do see much more, about $300 more in savings for the families who were in that group where they got the $50 deposit. So again, another example where getting them over this complicated barrier, which is not user-friendly at all, getting them a little bit of information and then tying them into a system, then they took some agency themselves, some ownership themselves, and we started to see these longer term kinds of impacts. I should note the thing we're negotiating right now is trying to get the transcript data from the Boston Public Schools, because we're curious to see when a parent is saving for college, does that have a feedback on the student and their likelihood of preparing academically because they think it's possible or they know it's possible. In fact, we surveyed the parents to see how many of them are actually talking to their child about what they're doing in terms of savings, the fact that they are saving for their child, and if that's a signal of encouragement. Okay, so I have to wrap up. Lessons from these. Information alone is not always enough. Sometimes with complicated processes we need more than that, but I'll leave you with 3 thoughts: rethinking policy and practice. Seemingly small barriers can make a big difference. So when we think about educational gaps, again, think about all those little tasks that people have to get done. Everything from reading to your child, signing up for kindergarten, going to parent-teacher conferences, to taking tests and so forth. And what we think of as small oftentimes can have huge effects. Interventions that help people get over those barriers, the nudges that we've seen, can be highly effective, although you have to think very carefully about what it is you're trying to get the family to do and what barrier you're getting them over. And so as we think about policy, certainly thinking about changing the overall infrastructure. So there's a lot of debate about changing the way that we do our financial aid applications. And in fact, when our study came out, the C.C. Rouse was the person to get a copy. She was in the Council of Economic Advisors, passed it along, and this is when Arne Duncan and President Obama, who was very new at the time, did a lot of simplification of the form. It was some evidence that they could use to try to change the way the whole overall process works, given the fact that it's unproductively complicated. Using personalized information to simplify processes and so forth. So you see this actually across all kinds of social policies, with outreach, with meeting people where they are to sign them up for benefits, and then thinking much more strategically about where we give our assistance. If there are things that are routine, let's get those, take care of them with technology or changing the processes so that we can focus time, whether it's teachers or counselors or parents, on the gaps where you really do need personalized attention and really perhaps need some assistance and hold-handing to get through.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Right, Sandra McNally, LSE and Surrey next.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me here. Yes, I'm going to talk a bit more about the UK than my previous 2 speakers, but it does follow on from their talks in other respects, in that I've been asked to talk about early years and vocational education, and well, we know a lot about early years. There's a lot of focus on that, and we know inequalities emerge preschool. Many people think they can be fixed then as well, although there's some variation in the evidence on that. But I actually want to start my talk about vocational education, which is sometimes called further education, professional and technical education, and other variants. In the US, I think it's more community colleges. Perhaps that includes in what, Bridget, what you were talking about. And here it's sort of further education is anything post-16 that isn't really A-levels, which is the academic track that most people take to prepare them for university. There is a relationship between early years and vocational education, in that many people, at least in the UK, who are the people responsible for looking after children in early year settings, in fact, have been educated in vocational education colleges. They haven't gone to university, and they're not university graduates. So if we think it's important to have the quality of care improved in early childcare settings, it's important that we think about what actually happens in these vocational education colleges, because that's where these people are being educated. I asked, do we care enough? Because I've started really working in vocational education within the last year to 18 months. We have a new research centre at LSE called the Centre for Vocational Education Research. And it doesn't take long to notice that there isn't the same volume or quality of research done on vocational education than there is in schools and higher education, and possibly in early years as well. It's can be quite hard sometimes to think, well, who are going to be the really key seminar speakers I would like to invite over, for example, for the seminar series in this area, at least in economics. And one response to that has been, well, the data isn't good enough. And that's true. The data in the UK has improved greatly, and we're benefiting from that. But it's true that traditionally perhaps we haven't had good enough data on that. Another issue as well, it's extremely complicated, and in the UK it is extremely complex, much more so than schools and higher education. But one troubling response has been when people say, well, the children of academics don't go to community colleges, they don't go to colleges of further education. The children of politicians and media types don't go to these places, so perhaps people just don't care enough. However, the people who are disadvantaged go to these places in very high numbers. And one way of looking at inequality is to say, well, given that a lot of people who have disadvantages end up in these places, surely we should care about the quality of the education they receive at the time they get there, because we might want more of them to go into universities and higher education, but the reality is most of them now and have been and are likely to go to these further education colleges. So if we're interested in equality and maybe improving the sort of things for people who don't go to university, maybe we should, as researchers, spend more time thinking about that and doing good papers on that. Just to illustrate my point that really most higher education is still rather privileged. This is the percentage of 25 to 34-year-olds in OECD countries that have a bachelor's degree or equivalent. Now, I realise the percentage would go up a little bit if I took a slightly older age group, but I wanted to focus on a more recent cohort. And in all of these countries, there is variation, but in most countries, it's under 30% of this age group. And most of these people are not from disadvantaged backgrounds. So if you're going to, if higher education is the answer to education inequalities, you'd have to have people going in much greater numbers than they are now. On the other end of the spectrum, this is a share of individuals with low numeracy skills from the PIAC study in the OECD. And you can see the last graph, the US and the UK were both quite good in terms of sending people to higher education. Unfortunately, they're also quite good in producing quite a lot of people with low numeracy skills. And these people are nowhere near college ready. These are extremely low numeracy skills. Having trouble with basic functioning, really. A worrying problem is that the problem doesn't seem to be reducing as much, according to PIAC anyway, amongst the younger generation compared to the old generation. In fact, the problem for the UK is actually a bit worse among 16 to 29-year-olds than it is among 30 to 54-year-olds. And if you look at the US, it's about the same. So according to this study, we're not really getting that much better. This is also strongly related to parental education, as indeed any kind of education indicator usually is, although the extent of that correlation varies between countries, and the UK stands out here as being a country with a very high relationship between parental education and basic skills, which is obviously very bad, because it's meaning that these people with low numeracy skills are highly likely to come from parents with below average education. So in that context, it may not surprise you to learn that in the English further education sector, for everybody who enters into it, about half are remedial second chance learners. Many of them are young people, but many of them are over 19 as well. What we have, I'm not showing you this, but countries do vary in the amount of higher vocational learning. The amount of higher vocational learning we have in the UK is relatively low. We have increasing numbers of people on apprenticeships. They're not necessarily very highly advanced apprenticeships. Most of them are not. Most of them are actually taken by people. The growth has been in people over the age of 25, so not the sorts of apprenticeship system that you see in Central and Northern Europe. It's an aspiration of the government to really, really push this and to have many more people do apprenticeships in the future. This is the English education system. Sorry if this is a bit small. Basically, what you should take from this is that compulsory education is really straightforward. That's the bottom part of the panel. You start school at age 5. There's no grade repetition. You go through various stages in the national curriculum, and you do your GCSE exam at age 16. If you do well, you do A-levels, or you do some types of vocational educational equivalents that are less well known, broadly can be loosely categorized as applied generals or tech levels. And from then you can go into university at age 18 usually, and that's the usually trajectory for people who do quite well. If, however, you don't do well, and that's lots of people, you can't just go into A-levels or to higher level vocational education, and you end up doing preparatory courses at the level of the GCSE at age 16, or even below that. There's some people who are doing educational courses that are classified as the educational equivalent to primary school level, and many people do that post-16. And then you get into all the coloured boxes, and that's where all the complexity is. And not only do you have people doing many different types of qualifications, they do different combinations of those qualifications, and they can do it in different types of institutions. Schools don't deal with people usually post-16 who are not equipped to go to A-level or equivalent, or equivalent being vocational education at that level. Further education colleges that are less well-resourced have all of those students, and there are lots of them. Once you get into apprenticeships, you have private providers as well, not just public providers. As I say, it really is a very complicated system. We have spent a very long time in the centre, the New Research Centre, trying to classify what people do at age 17 and predict where they end up, conditional on what they did at age 17. And I won't go through all the details with you. I don't have time. I just want to kind of explain things a little bit. So level 3 qualifications, that's sort of A-levels and vocational equivalents. That's the sort of thing we talk about, particularly A-levels. You would think if you were didn't know anything about English education that most people did A-levels, and that's not the case. It's, by age 18, only 40% or so of people are doing A-levels. And this is, I should say, is the whole census. So it's a whole cohort of the whole a particular group of students who left the national system at age 16. So it's everybody. It's about 550,000 people in a particular year. The economic studies suggest that if you do go on and get level 3 qualifications, whether they're A-levels or something else, there are positive labour market returns to that. The usual track has been for people to do A-levels and then go to university, although 35% or so of people, this cohort, go to university. Increasingly, it's the case that people are taking other types of qualifications apart from A-levels to get into university. Many people actually don't qualify to do level 3 qualifications at age 17. They usually don't have the grades, and they will, and this is where things get complex. And about 30% of the cohort are either doing level 2 or below qualifications, or they're unknown or not observed, which means they've dropped out of the system. So that's all very bad. And the difficult thing, it's just extremely hard to classify the education below, at level 2 and below, and to describe progression routes. And I thought that maybe we would find some progression routes that would be clear, and that hasn't been the case. The people who get onto these things that are level 2 and below in the red bars are very disproportionately come from low-income backgrounds, indicated by whether they've ever been eligible for free school meals in their time at school. One positive thing to say is that people on free school meals are observed in all types of qualifications, activities at age 17. So that there are people who do A-levels who have been eligible for free school meals. So some disadvantaged children do make it. However, they're very concentrated, they have a very high probability of ending up on these courses at age 17, simply because they probably don't have the grades to do any better at that age. This is what we will go through this much more in much more detail in a forthcoming paper, but some of the findings are that if you do start off at these level 2 or below qualifications at age 17, the progression to anything higher is relatively low. It's below half. In addition, many people appear to get stuck at low levels of learning for multiple years. A lot of these level 2 courses are not full-time courses, and they shouldn't last, they should certainly not last more than a year. However, you get many people ending up on 1, 2, 3, 4 consecutive years on these types of courses. Now, some of that, I mean, maybe you need to have lots of remedial education, but it suggests a system that isn't very well thought through. Finally, the people seem to think that apprenticeships are going to be an answer for people who don't go to university. But it's 20% of people in this age group, age 18 to age 17 to 20, who have an apprenticeship, who get onto an apprenticeship, typically not immediately after school. And that's not enough places to absorb people who don't want to go to university. There's also the fact that employers simply don't want to take on people who are just not work ready at all at that age. So one does need to think about what do people do at age 16 to 18 to prepare them for an apprenticeship or to prepare them for further higher levels of learning or indeed the job market directly. So policy challenges, well, a lot of the inequality agenda seems to be about widening access to higher education, but what about the rest, which is the majority? Shouldn't we think more closely about what happens to them as well and what exactly their education experiences are? I'd like to think that careers information and guidance would be important. It is. Most people in England know that it's a bit of a mess at the careers education and guidance system, and we need to do much to improve. And there's very interesting papers suggesting, like Bridget's paper, showing how that's important. But I would say that our post-16 options are a bit of a muddle. So it's not a question of providing careers information and guidance about this muddle. It's about trying to say, well, what are the progression routes, and how can you describe a system or have a better system that allows you to give good careers information and guidance to people about what they need to do to progress within it. And I think we need to have more research on what constitutes good quality in vocational education and how to get it, and I hope that our research centre will be able to contribute to that. But I'd be very interested in knowing more about what people are doing in the US about this, and any recommendations you have about people I should talk to or work I should become familiar with would be useful. Now, fixing inequality in the early years, well, this has become a big theme around the world. We know that socioeconomic gaps and cognitive indicators emerge at early years. At least in the UK, they do increase over time as well. And especially following the work by Heckman and others, investment in early years has become strongly advocated in many, many countries. And there is also very good evidence that intensive, targeted early intervention programs have long-lasting effects. There is increasing evidence on the effects of universal childcare. In general, that's positive, especially for disadvantaged students. But the effects do vary across country and context, and it isn't always positive. There are studies that show, for example, that childcare in Canada, that the quality of childcare wasn't very good, and that actually it was detrimental for people and not positive. But that's not typical. Mostly these studies do show some positive effect. Whether it's probably in many cases not strong enough to cancel out the income gaps that arise in educational attainment, though. In the UK, I've done some work with colleagues on one aspect of this in early years. We have seen big increases in funding over time in early years. One part of that has been extending universal childcare for 3-year-olds in 2005. From 2005 onwards, our evaluation focuses on 3-year-olds. And the provision was mostly provided through the private sector, private, voluntary and independent groups. There was basically a free entitlement, that people were entitled to 2.5 hours, 5 days a week, 33 days a week of free childcare provision. Now that's been extended, and it seems to be that the trend is to extend this in intensity and to also extend the number of people, the age of children at which parents can start receiving this sorts of benefits. Now, what actually happened was that free places, although free places increased by 50%, take up increased by a much smaller amount. So this was really subsidised. A lot of this was subsidised provision to parents who are already providing early childcare to their children, and the private voluntary independent sector tends to be of lower quality than the public sector, which is where the expansion took place. So in that context, maybe it might not surprise you that we only find small effects of this on anybody, and the effect on free school meal students is really small, about 3% of a standard deviation, and it doesn't last to age 7 or age 11. So we just don't find evidence, at least in this sort of dimension, that it had a positive cost-benefit ratio. It had costs were certainly higher than the benefits in that dimension. So we shouldn't automatically assume that simply having universal childcare means that we're going to get effects that are going to be positive and large, and that they're going to be long-lasting, or that they're going to be particularly beneficial to disadvantaged students. The big issues for policy are importance of quality, exactly what does it look like, how do you get it, and should everybody be receiving the same benefits anyway? I mean, it's one thing to say there should be some basic level of revision, but if the government increases the intensity, maybe should they do that in a more targeted way or not? I would say that perfectly designed early years policies wouldn't resolve educational inequalities, partly because, as Heckman says himself, early policies need to be reinforced. There is fade out in most education policies, no matter how good they are. And of course, the shocks people come to people as they get older, and in terms of just some of the problems and special needs emerge as people age, as people become adolescents, and then you've got all these things that can happen within families that are worse for people in disadvantaged circumstances, unemployment, family breakdown, that will need to be addressed somewhere. And if we only cared about what happens in compulsory education in early years, it would be too late for anybody who's coming through the education system and who's age 16 or older now, which is most people. So I think that we need to consider, I would say, the vocational education perhaps more seriously than we have done. That's it.
I think, Sean, you're here. So we've got 15 minutes for some questions. We covered a huge amount of ground. I'll open it up. Perhaps we could take 3 questions at a time. Any burning questions? I'm amazed, Sandra, you covered the whole English education system in one slide. I thought it was incredible. Over here on the left.
I have a question. As a parent of a public school child in the U.S. and a professor at a number of universities that have had educational programs, and I say, as this question, exempting Stanford and Harvard and Columbia, which have ed schools, but the ed schools that I've been exposed to at mid-range public universities have graduated teachers who are simply deplorable. And I would like to know what's being done to upgrade the quality of those teachers who are being inflicted on students in the U.S.
Okay, so quality of teachers, we'll come back to that. Are there other initial questions?
I can take it, that's fine.
Because one thing I wanted to add to all 3 of you was one of the things, I guess, that sort of relates to that quality of teaching is the quality of education. So Sean, you were talking about inequalities and achievement. I suppose one of the questions I have is, you saw a slight narrowing of the gap over time. I suppose one of my suspicions is that the middle classes are finding another bit of education that will will mean that they in life will succeed. So there's a sort of educational arms race, right? So you see a narrowing of gaps in a certain type of education. And Bridget, I was thinking this of higher education as well. So there are certain colleges that you might see, equilibrium, but then the middle classes find the more exclusive colleges or the more exclusive qualifications. So it'd be good to get your reflections on that. It's a kind of, educational arms race. And Sandra, you were sort of talking a bit about that as well. So is the cost to low numeracy getting higher, I guess, and the gains to exclusive education getting higher? So perhaps quality of teachers and what we can do about that, and then the sort of quality of education.
Sure. So Sean looked at me, and I decided to take the teacher education question. And one of my other hats is I'm academic dean at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, so I've learned quite a bit about our own personal training programs, even though it's a very small percentage of what the Harvard Ed School does. To briefly, I think, summarize a lot of what's been happening with teachers in the U.S. and the quality of teaching. One, you have changes in who's been attracted to the profession, as in particular for women and for people of color, as other opportunities have been available. There's a lot of stories that can be told about you're no longer attracting the best and the brightest. And then you bring them into education schools with varying quality, and I'll come back to that in just a moment, but also what happens when you produce teachers and you take them into a school district. And I can say this, my mom's a teacher, and she's talked a bit about how schools have changed over time and the freedom that they give teachers and the support that they give teachers in improving their practice over time. And so you have outstanding teachers who come into school districts who, through every regulation and everything that they have to do, and coming into cultures that are not supporting them to provide a quality education. And so over time, you see a lot of people leave, or they are acculturated into the norms of schools that are already struggling. What's one new teacher going to do in this larger school system? So what I think is changing over time, one, trying to attract people who are dedicated to education, and this gets back to the affordability issues that I talked about during my part of the presentation, just about public service in general. One of my earliest doctoral students at the Harvard Ed School did a paper about how loan debt was, people who were interested in education chose not to go into teaching because of debt. And California had a special program where they had loan forgiveness to try to bring the brightest and the most dedicated to come back into these public service kinds of fields. Second is rethinking the training model, not just giving, as you come to campus, telling you about classroom management, but you see education schools, Harvard and many, many others, taking much more seriously subject matter expertise, number one, and number two, thinking about professional development over the long term, where you have your internship with a master teacher, you go into the classroom, you're coming out and reflecting on what you've been learning. So it's not just we've been, giving you a few months and we throw you out there, but it's a continuous kind of process. And then third, something that gets to the more policy level, there's been some really great work, including by Susanna Loeb, who's a colleague of Sean's, saying that, we see these differences by district, but within district, there's a tremendous amount of variation in how well certain schools and classes are doing, and the way that policies are set up about which teacher goes where. And how you can have a tremendous amount of sorting where your best teachers are going to the more affluent, well-resourced schools, and the schools that are most disadvantaged are getting the teachers who are on the other side of the spectrum. And so how do we make that much more fair so that we're distributing our talent in different ways and hopefully reinforcing as teachers or peers with each other and try to support each other? So there's much, much more that could be done. But this gives you a quick summary of a lot of discussion that's been going on.
Bridget, just one quick question on that, because I think you've had discussions on the London effect here earlier. Would you pay teachers more, significantly more? Because there are worries, for example, if you're a young teacher in London, you just cannot afford to live here. So I think the outside school gates factors does impinge on that. Very quickly, would you?
Oh, that gets very complicated very fast.
Okay,
I mean, I'm certainly not opposed to paying teachers well and paying them a wage where they can actually live in the communities, because I think they're an important part of the communities. But then in the U.S., it gets very quickly to, do you pay for this? We're going to get to this question about quality. Do you pay for increasing test scores? Is that what we mean by having a good teacher, or do we mean something else?
Okay.
I'm much more concerned about getting the right people in the room who care not just about the test scores, but also all the other kinds of factors and are really dedicated to the profession.
Sean, do you just want to come onto that sort of quality of education point?
So the arms race point?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's a valid concern. So one way to tell the story of the last sort of 50 years of education in the United States is to sort of think of if you were a parent in the 1960s, you might not worry too much about your child's education because you ended up earning more than your parents did. There was an enormous amount of absolute mobility. And there were lots of high-paying working-class jobs that didn't require a college degree. And so in the 50s and the 60s and into the 70s, I think it was reasonable as a parent not to worry too much about your kids' success in school. But the economy collapses in the 70s, income inequality starts to grow rapidly, the returns to a college degree grow dramatically, and suddenly it becomes really important that your child do well in school so that she can go to college in a way that it didn't a generation before, and otherwise your child's not going to sort of be as well off as you or better. And so that creates a lot of anxiety on the part of parents about their children's education, and they start to invest more money and time if they have it. And as inequality grows, people who have, at the top end of the distribution have a lot more of that. And I think one way to sort of tell the story about the widening gap is there's this sort of what Craig and Valerie Ramey call the rug rat race, the sort of arms race of sort of investing in your kids young, and we see that. And then the question is, do we see that sort of turning around now, or is it just going to be that the most advantaged sort of find some other way to get advantage for their kids? And I'm going to just let myself be optimistic for a while until the data tells me otherwise, because so much when you sort of study inequality in the U.S. and education, it's often a kind of depressing story. So I'm gonna be happy that the trend has turned around, and until the data say otherwise, I'm gonna hope that that's just the way it is.
An optimistic academic, that's good. Sandra, can you just talk just on that theme? I was shocked to the fact that the low numeracy, that we're very good at creating innumerate young people. And you say that's getting worse. I mean, that's the other side of this, isn't it? Right. So Bridget and Sean were talking really partly about the top end and but there is this bottom end problem, and that's getting worse, and the penalties for that are getting worse, right?
Yes, I mean, because the returns to education have got higher. So with the labour market is changing, collapsing in the middle. So there really isn't much for those people to do, and they're pretty low pay jobs. So that they're it's the penalty to that is probably higher than it was when the labour market was different.
Yeah.
Although I haven't seen anything precise on that.
Right.
If I could interject, I was really struck by that chart, and I think the low numeracy links very much to what I was saying about remediation. The large, 35-40% in the U.S., that's very much driven by math remediation more than anything else. And when you look at those courses, they're courses that students should have taken in 8th grade. Basic algebra, basic math, and so forth. And so there is a lot of debate within the U.S. of how much should we require, how much of that, because we actually don't trust tests oftentimes, where we think it's a bad placement exam, or the student once knew it, but they didn't realize they were going to take this very high-stakes placement exam later on, and so forth. But it was amazing how close my percentage of math remediation links to the proportion you had in your chart.
Yeah, I think one interesting question, research question, will be to what extent is remediation, when it happens post-compulsory education, to what extent does that really have a payoff in the labour market or not? Because I don't think there's that much good evidence about that. And then how do you actually get it as well? What are the things you do for people who failed all the way through school and hate it? How do you then improve things in a matter of a year or two?
Any question? Oh, in the middle here.
I'll talk loud. No, there's a guy behind you with a mic.
Actually, I did have a question also.
So, last two
Duncan Chaplin from Mathematica. I was really interested in the discussion about the returns to early childhood education, and how I guess there was a study in Canada that didn't find much, and it sounds like you didn't find much. And at the same time, Sean is sort of pointing to the potential for parents providing more inputs to their kids. So I'm wondering if you guys have any thoughts about sort of the trade-off between parental training to get them to be better at caring for their kids versus early childhood education.
Do you want to take this other question as well? And this will be the last question, I'm afraid.
Well, this one's also for Sean. So I found it really fascinating when, to see that the income achievement gap seems to be dropping. And I was actually kind of interested because you're mentioning kind of the technology as being what you think is going on, and I was wondering what role, if any, might kind of the accountability systems and NCLB be playing with that recent dropping in the gap.
Sean, do you want to take that first, and then we'll talk about the payoff, the trade-off?
Yeah, so the decline in the gap we see is, we can only see it at kindergarten entry because these recent cohorts aren't old enough to show up in third grade test scores yet. So it's unlikely that NCLB is sort of driving changes in kids' school readiness. Certainly kindergarten teachers report having higher expectations for what kids should know than they did 15 years ago, and parents report being more focused on their kids' cognitive academic skills development than they were 15 years ago. One could make a case that's partly driven by not NCLB in terms of accountability, but by just the general focus on sort of tests and performance kind of percolating through the culture. But I think it's much broader than that. I think in the last 20 years in the US, there's been an enormous growth in the amount of attention to the importance of early childhood development, and lots of public information campaigns and public policy investments around the importance of early childhood and high-quality childcare, high-quality preschool, and encouraging parents to read to their kids and things like that. So I suspect it's more about that broad diffusion of the idea of the importance of early childhood development than it is sort of NCLB specific, though NCLB is sort of part of that whole package in some ways.
Sandra or Bridget, do you want to talk about that parenting versus early years? Any views on that?
Yeah, I don't think there is a trade-off as such. They're really properly understood as complements, good parental inputs and also early childcare. And it's long been thought that parents are really the most important driver of what educational attainment. And sometimes the successes of early childcare interventions have been because it's compensating for what children are not getting at home, and that's why the effects are so big. So that's all I have to say about that.
Yeah, I would just say briefly, for those kinds of studies, it's always about what's the counterfactual. And so the studies that haven't found large effects, it's about, well, you're taking them out of a mother's home where she would have been doing lots of one-on-one and so forth. And I want to underscore what Sean said earlier about technology, particularly at the younger ages and the kinds of technology that's very easy, sit your kid in front of it and so forth. But this question of whether or not technology exacerbates inequality or brings us closer together, I think we have turned a corner in early childhood. For higher education, that is still a tremendous debate because we thought online education was going to level everything. And I think, in fact, it's actually done the reverse. And I don't know if we'll ever swing around again because it's much, much more complicated and involves a lot of other different skills than, zombies, that your kids play with and that has math hidden in it, or Minecraft. Can you tell I have a 6 and 8 year old?
Right, we're going to have to wrap up there because I think we've got drinks on the 5th floor. Is that right, Jane? 6th floor. Okay. Okay. So it's in the library and there are drinks. I just want to say a few final words because one of the and thank you all. We'll clap you in a second. But one of the sort of other manifestations of educational equality in society. I saw the latest poll on Brexit here, right? The voting for outside, whether we leave Europe or not, and it was incredible if you look at the voting patterns for those without post-secondary education and those with. And I don't know if you all saw that, but basically those without were all Brexit, and those with post-secondary were basically in. And it was just, I was reflecting on this because I'm sure for Donald Trump there is exactly the same trend, and so it was just a sort of observation on how differences in education are reflected in society more generally. But anyway, we can maybe talk about that over drinks. I just want to thank these three brilliant experts. I think it was a wonderful session. Thank you very much.